The freezing rain had turned the parking lot of the long-term care home into a sheet of glass, and I almost wiped out twice, just walking from my car to the front doors. It was the first week of January, that dead stretch after the holidays, when the whole country seems to be running on cold coffee and regret, and I'd only come by to drop off a tin of butter tarts for the staff on the third floor, the way I did every year since my grandmother passed away there. I wasn't planning to stay. I wasn't planning to do anything except sign the visitor log, hand off the tin, and get back on the 401 before the roads got worse. The hallways smelled the way those places always smell, disinfectant trying to cover something it can't quite cover, and underneath it boiled vegetables and old radiators. I knew the route to the staff room by heart, but that day they'd done some kind of shuffle, moved residents around for a renovation on the east wing, and the numbers on the doors were off from what I remembered, so I walked slower, reading the little laminated name card slotted beside each room. And that's how I ended up standing frozen outside a door near the end of the hall, staring at a name I hadn't said out loud in almost 4 years. My former father-in-law's name was on the card, just his name in the home's standard font with a small printed snowflake somebody had added for the season. No photographs taped up beside it, no drawings from grandkids, none of the little things families put up to mark a room as belonging to someone who is loved. I told myself it was a coincidence of names. It's not that rare a name. But then I looked through the half-open door and saw him by the window, and there was no mistaking it. He'd gotten smaller. That's the thing nobody warns you about with old age. Not the wrinkles or the white hair, but the way a person seems to fold inward, like the air slowly leaking out of them. The man I remembered had been 6'2" and never once let anyone else carry the heavy end of anything. He used to call me kiddo even after I was 30. He built the deck on his cottage himself, and he'd remind you of that fact roughly every 20 minutes. Now he was sitting in a vinyl recliner with a thin blanket over his knees, watching the parking lot fill up with slush, and there was nobody with him, and there was nothing in the room that said anybody had been. A personal support worker came by with a cart, and I caught her before she got past me. I asked, kind of stupidly, whether the man in that room had family. She gave me a look I've thought about a lot since, not unkind, just worn down. The look of somebody who's watched this exact thing happen too many times to be surprised by it. She said he had a son, and the son had a wife now, and they'd done all the admission paperwork back in the fall. I asked if they came to visit. She straightened the boxes of gloves on her cart and said after a second, "Not really. Not for a while." I should have walked away. He wasn't my family anymore. The divorce had been clean enough as those things go. No kids to fight over. Just a condo to sell and a decade to mourn. I hadn't spoken to my ex-husband since the lawyers shook hands. I owed his father nothing. But I knocked on the doorframe anyway, and I said hi. He turned his head, and there was a long pause while his eyes worked at me, and then his whole face changed. He said my name like it cost him something. And then he said, soft, almost apologetic, "I thought you'd stopped coming." I didn't know what to do with that. I'd never come before. I'd never once visited him in this place. But the way he said it, like I'd been a regular and then gone missing, told me everything about what his days were like. Somewhere in his head there was a version of events where someone visited, and his brain had quietly assigned that role to me because I was a face he recognized from the good years. "I'm here now," I said, and I pulled the spare chair over and sat down, and the butter tart stayed in my bag for another hour. We didn't talk about much. He drifted. One minute he was asking me about the cottage roof and whether I'd had it looked at, and the next he was somewhere else entirely, telling me about a dog he had when he was a boy in Brockville, and I just followed him wherever he went. When I finally stood up to leave, he reached out and held onto my coat sleeve for a second, not saying anything, and I told him I'd come back. I meant it the way you mean a lot of things in January, with maybe 60% of yourself. But I did go back. The next Sunday and the one after that, I started bringing him date squares from the bakery near my place, because the second visit he mentioned his mother used to make them, and his whole face lit up like a kid's. Most days he was foggy. He'd ask me the same question 3 times. He'd call me by the name of a sister who died in the 90s. The staff started nodding at me in the hall like I belonged there, and one of the PSWs told me quietly that I was the only visitor he'd had since before Christmas. That sat in my chest for the whole drive home. I'm a bookkeeper, by the way. I do the books for a handful of small businesses around Kingston, a couple of restaurants, a landscaping outfit, a one-man law practice run by a friend of mine. I mention it because numbers are how my brain works. I notice when something doesn't add up, and the more time I spent in that room, the more something wasn't adding up, even if I couldn't have told you what yet. It came together on a Sunday in February. I'd shown up earlier than usual because the roads were clear for once. My former father-in-law was having one of his sharp days, and he did have them, sharp days, where the fog pulled back and the man I'd known came up to the surface for an hour or two before sinking again. We were talking about nothing, the hockey game, the weather, and then out of nowhere his hand came down on my wrist and gripped it, and his grip was strong, stronger than anything I'd felt from him in weeks. "Don't let them," he said. I asked him what he meant. His eyes were completely clear. That's what scared me. There was no fog in them at all. "They want me to sign," he said, "the papers. I keep telling them no. I'm not stupid. I know what I'm signing away even if they think I don't." He looked toward the door, then back at me, and lowered his voice. "They didn't put me in here because I needed it. They put me in here so I'd be somewhere they could manage me." I felt cold all the way down. I asked him what papers. What was he signing? Who was they? And I watched the clarity start to leave him even as I asked. His grip loosened. His forehead creased. And then he looked at me like he'd just noticed I was there and asked in a totally different, gentler voice whether I'd brought any of those squares. He was gone again. Whatever door had opened had swung shut, and I was left holding what he'd dropped through it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there doing the math I do, except this time it wasn't anybody's restaurant receipts. A man with money. And he did have money, I knew that much from the old days. He had the cottage on a lake near Westport, free and clear, plus whatever he put away over 40 years as a tool and die guy who never spent a dollar he didn't have to. A man with money, declining, with a son who'd quietly handled all the paperwork to put him somewhere, who didn't visit and who apparently kept showing up to get something signed. I'm not a suspicious person by nature, but I've seen enough sets of books to know what it looks like when somebody's positioning themselves to move money around before anyone can object. I went back 2 days later, on a Tuesday, which broke my Sunday routine. The door was open a crack and there were voices inside, and I stopped before I reached it because one of them was my ex-husband's. I hadn't heard his voice in 4 years. It does something to you hearing a voice like that again, all the muscle memory of a marriage you thought you'd packed away. He was talking to his father in a tone I remembered too, the patient, flattened tone he used when he'd decided the other person was being difficult and he was being the reasonable one. He kept saying it was just routine. He kept saying his father wouldn't even remember signing it by tomorrow, so what did it matter? And there was a woman's voice, too, his wife, sharper, more impatient, telling the old man he didn't need to understand it, that understanding it wasn't the point, that he should just trust his own son. I stood in that hallway with my heart going and my coat half unzipped, and I thought very clearly, this is none of my business. And then I pushed the door open anyway because there's a kind of wrong you can't keep walking past once you've heard it. The 3 of them looked up. My ex-husband's face did something complicated, surprise, then a fast scramble to cover it. His wife, whom I'd never met before that moment, looked me up and down like I was a delivery that had come to the wrong address. And my former father-in-law looked at me with this flicker of relief that just about broke me, because it meant some part of him knew exactly what was happening to him and had been waiting for someone to walk through that door. My ex-husband recovered first. He said my name and he asked what I was doing there, and he put on a smile that I'd been on the receiving end of for 10 years and knew to be worth nothing. I said I'd been visiting his father every week since January. I let that land. I watched it land. He didn't have an answer for it, because there isn't one, because if you haven't visited your own father since the fall and your ex-wife has been there every Sunday, there is nothing you can say. There was a manila folder on the rolling table, the kind they wheel over the bed. I could see paper sticking out of it. I asked as evenly as I could manage what they were having him sign. My ex-husband slid the folder a few inches toward himself and said it didn't concern me. His wife said something about how this was a private family matter with a little emphasis on the word family, in case I'd forgotten I was outside of it now. I didn't argue. That's the thing I'm almost proud of. Looking back, I didn't get loud, I didn't make a scene in front of a confused old man. I just said that I'd noticed his father had been telling people he didn't want to sign anything and that as far as I knew, you weren't supposed to keep pushing somebody to sign documents they'd said no to. I said it like an observation, not an accusation. And I watched my ex-husband's jaw tighten. And I watched his wife's eyes narrow. And I knew I'd hit something. His wife smiled at me then, the way you smile at a child who's wandered into an adult conversation. She said it was sweet, really, that I was playing the rescuer, that I'd always had a soft spot for lost causes. She said it like she knew me, like he'd talked about me, and the casual cruelty of it told me a lot about the kind of household decisions were being made in. I looked at her, and I looked at the old man in the chair who was watching all of this, with his hands twisted together in his lap, and I said the only thing that felt true. I said that maybe 4 years ago this man wasn't my business, but he'd been kind to me when I was young and scared and married into a family that didn't always make room for me, and I'd be back, and I'd keep coming back, and they could decide what they wanted to do with that. My ex-husband told me not to bother. I told him I would, and then I left, before my voice could shake, and I sat in my freezing car in that glassy parking lot for 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. Here's what I did instead of going home and stewing. The next morning I called my friend, the lawyer I keep the books for. His practice is mostly real estate and wills, small stuff, the bread and butter of a mid-size Ontario city, but he knows the territory. I told him the whole thing over coffee in his cramped little office above a hardware store. He listened the way he listens to everything, slowly, turning a pen over in his fingers. When I finished, he asked me a couple of questions that I hadn't even thought to ask myself. He asked whether anyone had ever had my former father-in-law's capacity formally assessed. He asked who currently held power of attorney for his property and whether it was an old document or a new one. He explained, and this is the part I want to get right, because it's the part that mattered, that in this province a person has to actually have the capacity to understand what they're signing for a continuing power of attorney for property to be valid, and that if someone signs one while they don't understand it, that document can be challenged, and in some cases set aside entirely. He told me there's an office, the public guardian and trustee, whose whole job includes looking into exactly this kind of thing, an incapable person being financially pressured by the people who are supposed to be looking after them. I asked him what I should do, and he said the honest answer was that I had no legal standing. I wasn't family, I wasn't anyone's attorney, I was a former daughter-in-law who'd happened to start visiting. But, he said, slower now, that didn't mean nothing could be done. A concern could be reported, a capacity assessment could be requested, and, he added, looking at me over his glasses, the family member who keeps showing up with documents tends to behave a lot more carefully when there's suddenly a third party in the room taking notes. So I asked him to come with me. He didn't have to. There was nothing in it for him. But he closed his laptop and said he had Thursday afternoon free, and that he'd come not as anybody's lawyer, exactly, but as a witness, and that sometimes a witness was all it took. I want to slow down here, because this is the part I've replayed the most. We walked into the home together that Thursday. I'd called ahead, not to my ex-husband, but to the home itself, and learned that the family had booked time that afternoon. They'd told the staff they were bringing some paperwork for Dad to take care of. So I knew they'd be there. We came up to the 3rd floor and down the hall that I now knew better than I'd ever wanted to, and the door was open, and the 3 of them were arranged exactly as before. The folder was back on the rolling table. My ex-husband saw me, and then he saw the man beside me, who he didn't recognize, and I watched him do the calculation. He asked what this was. His voice had lost the smooth edge from Tuesday. I said this was someone who understood what those papers actually meant. My friend stepped forward and introduced himself, calm, almost bored sounding, which I've since learned is a skill. He said he was there regarding any documents being presented to the gentleman in the chair, and that before anyone signed anything, there were some questions worth answering, namely whether a capacity assessment had been done, and whether the person being asked to sign actually understood the nature and effect of what was in front of him. He said the words nature and effect like they were a door clicking shut. My ex-husband's wife crossed her arms and asked with real contempt whether I'd brought a lawyer. My friend answered before I could. He said no, that nobody had retained him, that he was simply present, and that anything signed by a person who lacked capacity could be challenged and reversed, and that a formal assessment could be requested by more than one party, including the home itself and the public guardian and trustee. He let that sit. Then he said mildly that if everything here was above board, then nobody had anything to worry about from a few questions. And here's the thing. My former father-in-law had been quiet the whole time, watching, hands in his lap. But he'd been having one of his sharp days. I could tell by the way his eyes were tracking the conversation, moving from face to face, taking it in. My ex-husband must have sensed the room slipping, because he turned to his father and dropped the cold tone and put on something warm and pleading, and he said, "Dad, you trust me, right? You know I'd never do anything that wasn't for your own good." There was a long silence. My former father-in-law looked at the folder on the table. Then he looked at his son, and then, with a steadiness in his voice I hadn't heard since the deck and the dog and the cottage roof, he pushed the folder a few inches away from himself and said that he didn't put his name on things he didn't understand, and that lately there was an awful lot he was being asked to understand very quickly. That was when my ex-husband lost it. Not in a big dramatic way. He just slapped his hand flat on the rolling table, hard enough that the water jug jumped, and he said in a low, furious voice, "After everything I've done for you." And the old man flinched, and then he sat up a little straighter, and he said the thing I'll never forget. He said, "You didn't do any of this for me. You did it for the cottage." The wife stepped in then, trying to grab the wheel back, saying he was confused, that he didn't know what he was saying, that we were the ones taking advantage of a sick old man. My friend didn't raise his voice. He just said that if there was a genuine question about capacity, then the responsible thing was to request a proper assessment, and that until one was done, no document should be signed, and that he'd be making a note of today's date and what had taken place. He said he was sure everyone wanted to do this properly. My ex-husband stared at me with a look I'd seen exactly once before. The day I told him I was done, and he asked whether I really thought this changed anything. And I told him the truth, which was that it already had. Because the whole thing only worked in the dark, and the dark was gone now. I'd love to tell you it ended in that room, all tied up. It didn't. Real life takes longer than a video. What happened was this. The home had its own obligations once a concern was raised. They're required to take that kind of thing seriously, and they did. A note went into his file. The staff, who'd clearly had their own quiet suspicions for months, became a lot more attentive to who was coming and going and what was being asked of him. My friend helped me put together a written concern to the public guardian and trustee, laying out what I'd heard and seen, dates and times, the conversation in the hallway, the folder, the pressure. I wasn't sure anyone would take a former daughter-in-law seriously, but it turned out that what mattered wasn't who I was related to. What mattered was that the concern was specific and credible, and that there was now a paper trail. A capacity assessor came, an actual designated assessor, someone trained to evaluate exactly this. I wasn't in the room for it, and I didn't want to be. What I understood afterward was that capacity isn't a single switch, on or off. A person can lack the capacity to manage complicated finances and still have the capacity to understand certain decisions, and the assessment looks at the specific decision in front of them. The upshot was that the documents my ex-husband had been pushing, a continuing power of attorney for property that would have handed him control of everything, and a transfer that would have moved the cottage out of his father's name for what I can only assume was going to be a song, weren't going anywhere. There were too many flags now, And once the public guardian and trustee's office got involved and started asking my ex-husband for an accounting of what he'd already been doing with his father's money, under whatever informal arrangement he'd set up, the whole thing turned from a quiet little inheritance grab into something he very much did not want examined. I'd be lying if I said I felt sorry for him. He came to the home one more time in March, alone. No wife, no folder, none of the confidence. He found me in the little family lounge near the elevators where I'd taken to having my coffee. He said I'd always had to ruin things. He said it tired, more than angry, like a man who'd watched a plan come apart and couldn't find anyone to blame but the obvious target. I didn't have much to say to him. I'd said it all in that room. He left, and as far as I know, he hasn't been back. And his name came off the visitor log entirely, which I noticed because I still sign it every Sunday. But the part that matters, the part I'd been carrying since the day in February when he grabbed my wrist, that came later, and it came from him. It was the end of March, the snow finally rotting away into that gray Kingston slush that means spring is theoretically coming. He was having a sharp day. I'd brought the date squares. He waited until the PSW had gone and the door was mostly shut, and then he reached over to the drawer of his side table, the one with the little lock that residents are allowed, and he took out a worn manila envelope, soft at the corners from being handled. His hand shook, but not from the fog. He held it for a second before he gave it to me, and he said he'd been waiting. He said he'd had to be sure it was really me. Sure I was actually going to keep coming and not be one more person who showed up once and vanished. And then he told me that back in the fall, before any of this, when he could still feel himself slipping and knew what was coming, he'd done something. He'd had a real lawyer come to the home, quietly, without his son, in one of those early weeks when his head was still mostly clear. He'd made a new will. He'd named a new attorney for property. And he'd written it all down, what he wanted, while he still could, and he kept the copy locked in that drawer because he didn't trust anyone enough to give it to them. I opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of the new will and a letter in his own handwriting, the careful slanted cursive of a man taught to write by nuns in the 40s. The will left the cottage, the one he'd built the deck on, the one he'd reminded everyone he'd built the deck on, to a community land trust on the lake, to be kept as a day-use spot for families who couldn't afford their own, with a small endowment from his savings to maintain it. His son got a specific, modest amount, no more. And there is a line in the letter that I've read more times than I can count, where he wrote that he'd watched his son become a man who measured people by what they'd leave behind, and that he refused to leave behind one more thing for that to be true of. He'd named the home's social worker and a lawyer as his attorneys, not me. I want to be clear about that because for a while afterward people assumed I'd ended up with something, and I didn't. And I'm glad I didn't, because it would have given the story a different shape than the one it actually has. What he gave me wasn't money. In the letter, the last paragraph, he'd written that the woman who kept coming when no one made her, who brought him his mother's squares and sat with him on the days he didn't know his own name, had reminded him that he'd been worth visiting all along. He asked me to come to the cottage in the summer when the trust opened it up and sit on the deck he built and think of him whether he was still around to know it or not. That's the part that made me put the envelope down on my knees and cry in a vinyl chair in a long-term care home on a gray afternoon in March, while an old man I was no longer technically related to patted my hand and told me, a little confused now, the fog rolling back in, that it was all right, that I shouldn't take on so. He made it to the summer. Just. We took him out to the cottage in July, the social worker and a PSW and me, and we sat him on the deck in the good sun, and he looked out at the water for a long time and didn't say much. And I don't know how much he understood of where he was. But at one point he reached over and held onto my sleeve the way he had that first January day, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't need to. He passed in his sleep at the end of August. The trust opened the cottage to families the next spring with a little wooden sign by the deck that has his name on it, and a snowflake somebody added that I think about every time I drive past in the winter. I still sign the visitor log at that home every Sunday. I bring date squares for whoever's on the third floor, with no one coming for them, because it turns out there's always somebody, and somebody is usually all it takes. What stays with me isn't the confrontation in that room. It's the smaller thing underneath it. The decision I made in a hallway to knock on a door that wasn't mine to knock on. I keep circling back to it, because everything else followed from there. If I'd kept walking, my former father-in-law would have signed those papers on some foggy afternoon. The cottage would have quietly changed hands, and nobody would have known a thing was wrong. That was the whole design. The scheme only worked as long as no one stopped to look. I think about how easy it would have been to tell myself it wasn't my business. He wasn't my family anymore. I had a clean excuse and no one would have blamed me for using it, but there's a difference between what you're allowed to ignore and what you can actually live with ignoring. And somewhere along the line, I'd learned those aren't the same thing. Doing right by Gordon cost me nothing but a few Sundays and a long drive up the highway. That's usually all it costs, in my experience. We just tell ourselves the price is higher so we don't have to pay it. The other thing I've come to understand is that caring about him on its own wouldn't have saved him. Feeling something got me into the room. Paying attention is what mattered. Noticing the figures that didn't sit right, asking who held what, knowing enough to call my friend instead of storming in alone. Reed was counting on me being soft and unprepared, the way he'd always read me. What he didn't count on was that I'd stop and think before I moved, that I'd bring a witness and a paper trail instead of a raised voice. Anger would have lost that room in 5 minutes. A clear head won it, and none of it would have held if I'd only shown up once. Bethany called me a rescuer like it was something to be ashamed of. But a rescuer who quits after one bad afternoon isn't much use to anyone. The thing that actually protected him was the most ordinary thing imaginable: coming back. Sunday after Sunday, through the freezing rain and the days he called me by his dead sister's name, long after it stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like a habit. That steadiness is what made the staff trust me, what made my account credible, what finally made him hand me that envelope. He'd been waiting to see whether I'd last. Reed measured people by what they'd leave behind, and in the end, that's the very thing that undid him, because a man who only takes can't understand a father who'd rather give a cottage to strangers than to a son who couldn't be bothered to visit. He left behind nothing worth keeping. His father left behind a deck full of families who'll never know his name. I still sign that log every Sunday. The right thing rarely asks more of us than our time, only that we keep offering it.